Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. And I want to thank the Wisconsin Psychoanalytic for inviting me. And thank you for the introduction. And I'm pleased to hear that for this 2-hour presentation that I'm going to be offering you, that Wisconsin Psychoanalytic had the highest number of registrants that they've ever had for any webinar or any session presentation that they've ever had in their entire history. So thank you. That's always a nice thing to hear. So here we go. Now I'm going to try to, this part, this video, this always gets me a little anxious. The slideshow showing it. Let me just play from start. And now let me screen share. And please cross your fingers for me. Screen share. Here we go. And here's hoping that you can see it. So can everybody see it? Here's hoping. All right. So my talk today is basically on model 1 of the Stark method of psychodynamic synergy, the interpretive perspective of classical psychoanalytic theory. And this talk is entitled Conflict Statements, Optimally Stressful Growth Incentivizing Conflict Statements that Create Mismatch Experiences. But I'm sort of leaping ahead of myself here. But leveraging the patient's anxiety to incentivize transformation and growth. And as you'll be hearing throughout, the word incentivize is critically important here, to catalyze or incentivize, not even just promote, but incentivize, catalyze. And I want to issue a special thanks to Lisa, Tara, and Valerie. All right. Sort of visual to help you with this. In essence, I'm going to be talking about leveraging the pain of contrast between what is and what could be. Or, as I will be saying throughout, the bad, the old bad that is, and the new good that could be. So that's what basically I'm going to be talking about today, and what conflict statements are strategically designed to address. We cannot avoid suffering, but we can choose how we cope with it, how we find meaning in it, and how we move forward with renewed purpose. Although often misattributed to the existential psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, the author of this evocative quote is actually unknown. Many of you know it. Between stimulus and response is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Applying this to the clinical situation, we could say between stressor and what follows is a space. In that space is our power either to react defensively when the stressor is simply too much for us to manage, which will thwart our growth, or to respond adaptively when we are more able to take that stressor in stride, which will, of course, promote our freedom. Not only do we have the power to choose how we make meaning of our lives, but we also have the responsibility to do so. It has been suggested that 10% of what happens to us is life, but 90% is how we either defensively react or adaptively respond to it. And throughout my talk, I'm going to be highlighting the distinction between defense and adaptation, between reaction and response, between rigidity and resilience, between rigid defense and more resilient adaptation, between less evolved and more evolved. So defensive reaction, mindless, thoughtless, reflexive, and adaptive response, more mindful, more thoughtful, more considered, more reflective. Okay. Carl Jung's lovely quote, "I'm not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." So throughout, we're going to be talking about empowerment, choice, having the capacity and exercising it to make choices about how we react defensively or respond adaptively to the myriad stressors that are coming our way, moment by moment, day by day. Please note that I do not limit defenses to the well-known, more traditional ones, like repression, projection, dissociation, somatization. Rather, I define defenses more broadly as referring to any of the self-protective mechanisms that we mobilize when made anxious in the face of stressors. In that vulnerable moment, either we, made anxious, react reflexively by rigidly defending against the stressor, which would be a defensive, mindless reaction, or we, more flexible, respond reflectively by resiliently adapting to the stressor. In other words, an adaptive, more mindful response. So I'm just kind of wanting to sort of highlight defensive, mindless reaction on the one hand, and adaptive, more mindful response on the other. And the Stark method of psychodynamic synergy is all about, I have 5 modes of therapeutic action, as I'll be explaining in a moment: classical psychoanalytic, self-psychological, contemporary relational, existential humanistic, and quantum neuroscientific. There, I said it. Those are the 5 modes, models 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And all of them are about advancing the patient from defensive reaction to adaptive response. And I'm just going to kind of give something away a little bit here. All of the defensive reactions in the 5 models, all of them start with the letter R. Model 1, resistance. Model 2, relentless hope. Model 3, reenactment. Model 4, retreat. And model 5, refractory inertia. Those defenses correspond to classical psychoanalytic, self-psychological, contemporary relational, existential humanistic, and quantum neuroscientific. Not that you're expected to sort of like, oh, I get it, but I just want to kind of begin to sort of give you the, plant this a little bit in you so that as we continue, it'll make more sense. So we go from defense, those R words, to adaptation. Those all start with the letter A, as it happens. So in model 1, it would be from resistance to insight. Oops, insight doesn't start with the letter A. So I'm going to have to say awareness, self-awareness, introspective awareness, self-reflective awareness. So model 1, from resistance to awareness. And our focus today will be on that. Model 2, from relentless hope, my concept, relentless hope, to acceptance. Model 3, from compulsive and unwitting reenactment of unmastered early on relational traumas, to accountability. And Stephanie Barthmere highlighted that it's actually really relational accountability, but relational starts with an R, so think relational, but I'm just going to say accountability. And then model 4, from the existential humanistic approach, from retreat to accessibility or availability, or as I've sometimes said, from relational absence to authentic presence. And model 5, the quantum neuroscientific approach, from, as I've mentioned earlier, refractory inertia, non-action, but refractory inertia, model 5, to action, actualizing action. All right, anyway. Okay, I'm way ahead of myself here. But so on the left are the defensive, mindless reactions, and we want to advance the patient by way of iterative healing cycles of disruption, repair, destabilization, restabilization in an ongoing way. And we'll do that by way of constructing optimally stressful, growth incentivizing mismatch experiences between, hearkening back to that those first and second slides, old bad and new good, old bad, new good, old bad, new good. All right, for some of you, it's like, what? And for others of you, it's like, oh, yeah, I kind of am getting that now. All right, life is not about defensively waiting for the storm to pass, but adaptively learning to dance in the rain. I love that one. This one is one of my favorite slides. A mindful response would be, I'm never going to eat that much again. A more mindless reaction, oh, look, food. So much for one's mindful resolve never to eat that much again. A dramatic demonstration of the direct relationship between flexibility and thriving. Decades ago, two obstetricians made an intriguing discovery about the paradoxical relationship between regularity of fetal heart rate and fetal mortality. They discovered that counterintuitively, the more metronome-like the heartbeat, lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, the less likely the fetus would be to survive. Whereas the greater the heart rate variability, lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, lub, the more likely the fetus would be to thrive. In other words, variability, heart rate variability, adaptability, flexibility, resilience, and Tom Brady's pliability. Obviously, you can tell I'm from New England. Patriots, Tom Brady. And Tom Brady's pliability are critically important for the health of both body and mind. Now, the relationship between defense and adaptation, I hasten to add, is a yin-yang relationship. These self-protective mechanisms, both defense and adaptation, are, after all, self-protective mechanisms. They're complementary, not opposing forces. Furthermore, all defenses have an adaptive component, of course, just as all adaptations serve a defensive function. Nonetheless, and more generally, although defenses might once have been necessary for the patient to survive, as rigid defenses incrementally, progressively morph, evolve into more flexible, more resilient adaptations, the patient becomes ever better able to thrive. Indeed, the therapeutic action in deep embodied treatments is designed to transform rigidity into resilience and surviving into thriving. From surviving to thriving. Okay. Now, therapeutic modalities that have profound and sustained, enduring psychodynamic change as their ultimate goal. So, for example, psychoanalysis and other depth psychologies, including but not limited to ACT, IFS, EMDR, ISTDP, AEDP, EFT, NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, somatic experiencing, Peter Levine's, sensory motor psychotherapy, Pat Ogden, and psychomotor psychotherapy, Al Peso, must ultimately be able to transform. Either we can say, in the more traditional words of psychoanalysis and ego psychology, low-level defense into higher level defense or more evolved adaptation, or in the words of acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, psychological rigidity into psychological flexibility, as they say, and I'm just going to change that to psychological resilience, from rigidity to resilience, such that the patient, whatever her starting point, so it's not specifically DSM stuff and diagnostic categories, though you'll see in a moment that I use a few of those diagnostic terms, but that's not the focus here, but rather that the patient, whatever her starting point, whatever her initial level of functionality, whatever her diagnosis, I shouldn't put that, I'm going to change that, whatever her level of rigidity or defensiveness. That's what I should really put. Yeah, I should really change that. I should change that. I will. All right. That the patient will become ever better able, as a result of the treatment, over time, to manage the myriad stressors in her life to which she's being continuously exposed, ever more adept at responding adaptively and mindfully instead of reacting defensively and mindlessly. And I want to be highlighting here that I think an important part of deep embodied treatments has to do with helping all of us, certainly our patients, but we too, helping us to manage, to cope with, to take in our stride all of the many stressors that come our way moment by moment, whether we react defensively or respond adaptively. And one of my books, this isn't a conflict of interest because it's free, is entitled The Transformative Power of Optimal Stress, from cursing the darkness to lighting a candle. And every now and then when I'm like reacting defensively and mindlessly and reflexively to some stressor that has come my way, my dear sweet Gunner will say, now, you want to remember that instead of cursing the darkness, you want to light a candle. Indeed, indeed. So as we all go through our lives, moment by moment, to think about how easily you're able to manage, to cope with, to tolerate, to take in your stride all of what's coming your way. Because we do have a choice, either to react, a la Viktor Frankl, but not really Viktor Frankl, but either to react defensively, which is more sort of same old, or to respond adaptively, to do something new good, something new, different, and compellingly better than same old, same old. Okay. Okay, here we go. The ultimate goal of deep embodied treatments, ever less psychological rigidity and ever more psychological flexibility, resilience. And yeah, and if is there a cultural bias there? I don't know. Somebody had asked about that once, and they're like, I don't know, I don't think so. I think around the world, this is an important something, from rigidity to resilience. All right, in essence, therapeutic modalities that have deep embodied healing and second order change. That always sounds to me as if that would be less good than first order. But actually, second order means a quantic leap that reorganizes the system at a deeper level, whereas first order change is a little more superficial, a little more behavioral. Now we're talking about at a deeper level, second order change. So therapeutic modalities that have deep embodied healing and second order change as their ultimate aim must indeed be able to catalyze transformation. There's that word catalyze, transformation of rigidity into resilience. More specifically, they must be able to provoke, not just promote, but provoke evolution of the patient from the entrenched, conditioned reality, neural entrenchment of the bad that was and still is, to the enlivening quantum possibility of the good that could be. Indeed, whenever opportunity presents, the therapist, ever attuned, I'm going to be talking a lot about attunement, whether it's homeostatic attunement, which is being exactly where the patient is in the moment, or disruptive attunement, which is directing them to where you would want them to go, but still attuned to them. So the therapist, whenever possible, and ever attuned to the level of the patient's anxiety, the finger ever on the pulse of the level of the patient's anxiety, and capacity to tolerate further challenge, will alternately be with the patient where she is, the conditioned old bad, usually, and alternately direct the patient's attention to elsewhere, the envisioned new good. This is broad strokes. We'll be refining it and highlighting the nuances as we continue. In essence, the therapist will be juxtaposing, such an important word here, juxtaposing to create a leveraging, empathic support of the patient's defenses. Yes, empathic support. Now here, support does not mean agreeing with, oh yes, I agree with you. Empathic support has to do with an empathic positioning of the therapist's self in relation to the patient's defenses. And a la Bob Stollerow in his earlier writing, the therapist's decentering from her own subjectivity, her own stance, her own biases, her own prejudices, and her own self, and joining alongside the patient and taking on the patient's experience but only as if it were her own. It doesn't actually become her own. Rather, she resonates empathically with it, meaning she understands the fact of it and appreciates on some level, on some deep level, the patient's need to be defending in the ways that the patient does. But it's not about who she is because she has decentered from her own subjectivity and joined alongside of the patient and taken on the patient's subjectivity for the moment. But it doesn't become her subjectivity. She takes it on as if it were her own. Whew. Okay, so the therapist will be juxtaposing empathic support, which doesn't mean agreement, but support of the patient's defenses, understanding the patient's need to have them, with destabilizing, anxiety provoking, there's that word again, anxiety incentivizing challenge of them. So, in the words of Jim Herzog, and later elaborated upon by Salman Akhtar, homeostatic attunement on the one hand, that's the empathic support, with disruptive attunement on the other. And this is where I have to tell my funny story. I was on a panel with Jim Herzog recently, a year or two ago, when I was at the conference that I co-direct at the Harvard Medical School conference at the Fairmont Copley Plaza every spring. I'm on the panel and I'm up there and I'm doing my presentation. And I say, oh, homeostatic attunement, disruptive attunement a la Salman Akhtar, because I'd heard Salman talk about it at length. At which point, Jim Herzog, ever the gentleman, who's also on the panel, he's seated, I'm at the podium, says, oh, Martha, if I could be so bold, actually, that was my concept from, from over a decade earlier. But Salman admittedly went on to develop it in a lovely way. I said, oh my God, I am so sorry. So anyway, here we have, it's Jim Herzog originally and Salman Akhtar who developed it in a way that makes wonderful, beautiful sense for me. It's a beautiful concept. Anyway, these juxtapositions to create optimally stressful, growth incentivizing mismatch experiences, which is at the heart of the therapeutic action in deep embodied treatments. Anyway, these juxtapositions of conditioned old bad with envisioned new good will inevitably create optimally stressful, growth incentivizing mismatch experiences for the patient. The graduated working through and resolution of which will constitute the therapeutic action in deep psychodynamic treatments. Now, there's so many different ways to describe the juxtaposition, old, bad, new, good, old, bad, new, good. Just think about EMDR. Right brain, old, bad. Left brain, new, good. Right brain, emotional, relational. Left brain, future-oriented, analytic. Left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right is, or neurolinguistic programming, or hypnotherapy. One of my supervisees, a hypnotherapist par excellence, who's very psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, and so on. I was so excited. I was telling him about my ideas here, and he said, "Oh my God!" He said, "Martha, no offense, but we hypnotherapists have been doing juxtaposition of left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, or new good, old, bad, new good, old, bad, forever." And sort of, oh, okay, little humbling, come to find out, sort of like reinventing the wheel on my part, but sort of like, oh, okay. And anyway, so optimally stressful, growth incentivizing mismatch experiences are being created by juxtaposing to create internal dissonance and homeostatic imbalance. So the homeostatic attunement is sort of reinforcing the homeostatic status of things, albeit dysfunctional. Disruptive attunement is creating a state of dishomeostasis. More later. Okay, I love this image here. Optimally stressful, growth incentivizing mismatch experiences. I hope that by the end of our time here, those words, kind of big words, but they'll just roll off your tongue, created by juxtaposing challenge of defense with its support. In other words, optimally stressful, destabilizing internal tension to incentivize, there's that word, growth. Now, interestingly, I do want to say, I go and I look at the descriptions on Psychology Today of how people describe the safe therapeutic space that they create for the people who come their way. And interestingly, just about everybody emphasizes, and fair enough, but they emphasize what I would describe as the holding. And they don't actually get to the provocation, the thing that would incentivize or provide leverage, incentivize transformation and growth. Now, they may or may not actually do that, but they don't emphasize that. Instead, they talk about we create a safe space, trusting so you can feel safe to go back and remember if need be, and just feel safely held within the context of a secure, safe attachment to me, the therapist. And very few people say, no pain, no gain, and no mud, no lotus, or optimal stress to incentivize transformation and change. And then when cases are presented to me in my entirely free, weekly, ongoing 90-minute spot supervision Zoom sessions on Thursdays from 12 noon to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, both live and recorded. You can join if you want. Just email me, Martha Stark, MD, at synergymed.solution. It is true that for the most part, the cases that are presented, for the most part, are about creating a really safe space, the holding. And every now and then, though, a case will be presented where somebody has dared to provoke a little bit by introducing an anxiety-provoking challenge to the dysfunctional status quo of things. And then it's interesting. So yes, the patient then feels a little anxious, but then you can support in a way that will ease their anxiety. So you increase the anxiety, ease it, increase, ease, increase, decrease. And my optimally stressful interventions in all 5 of my modes indeed both challenge, thereby increasing the anxiety, and support, thereby decreasing the anxiety. Ernest Hemingway's, and of course, a million people since, the world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places. For any of us who indeed have had experiences of ruptures in relationships, and the privilege of working that through, as difficult as it might be in the moment, it is true that things are then stronger at the broken places. And this next slide, one of my favorite slides, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Now, I don't know, maybe AI did that. I don't know whether AI did it or not, but quite frankly, I find it quite delightful. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. All righty. All right, so neuroscientist Charles Krebs, bless his soul, he's up here in Boston, and for years, he and I and Bessel van der Kolk and John Rady and a number of other folks, Doug Watts, were part of a neuroscience study group that met once a month. And Charles Krebs was amazing, and I learned a lot at his feet. Charles Krebs, neuroscientist, reminds us that open, self-organizing, complex, adaptive, in other words, chaotic systems resist perturbation. Examples of chaotic systems include road traffic, the stock market, ocean turbulence, and hurricanes. I just had to throw that in there. Hurricanes are chaotic systems, and many of you may know that my dear sweet Gunnar and I, lost our home down in Clearwater Beach a year ago to Hurricane Helene. It's now September 2025, and we lost it a year ago. We haven't yet been able to get it back up on its feet, so it's uninhabitable. We'll get it back eventually. We just don't have it yet. Anyway, that's the chaotic system, hurricanes. And the self-protective mechanisms mobilized by anxious patients desperately attempting to manage, to cope with, to deal with the stressors in their lives. Self-organizing systems, fueled as they are by their homeostatic tendency to remain constant over time, are inherently resistant to change. In other words, our patients, much as they might protest their desire to change, I want to change, I want to change. First of all, many of them want the world to change. But anyway, but those who do want to change, they protest their desire to change. They have an innate inertia that must be overcome. And quite frankly, usually they're ambivalent about changing, or they would have changed before now. So people are ambivalently attached to their defenses. And I emphasize that a little bit more later, but defenses both serve and cost. There's both benefit and price paid. All right, so our patients have an innate inertia that must be overcome if they are ever to be energetically released from the toxicity of their past and empowered to embrace love, work, and play to their greatest potential going forward. Self-organization, chaotic systems, self-organization is synonymous, and dynamics between people in a parent-child relationship, patient-therapist relationship, couples, boss-employee, self-organization, systems is synonymous, not necessarily with health, maybe with health, but maybe not, but synonymous with stability. It's difficult to self-organizing systems, in the words of Charles Krebs, resist perturbation. So you think of a rubber band and you pull it out and you let go and it snaps back. Self-organization is synonymous with stability, and that's what we're talking about here. So we might well challenge, pull the rubber band out a little bit, but so challenge, get. So in other words, to incentivize, to get the patient from defense, rigidity to adaptation, resilience, there will be a series of destabilizations in reaction to challenge, anxiety-provoking challenge, and then repair in response to anxiety assuaging support, and by tapping into the innate resilience of the underlying system, the wisdom of the body, our inborn capacity to cope with optimal stress. You have to believe in the wisdom of the body. I do. And the wisdom of our resilience. I believe in that. We have to believe in that. Now, it took me years to appreciate something that is at once both obvious and deeply profound. Namely, it will be input from the outside and the patient's evolving capacity to process, integrate, and adapt to the impact of this input that will ultimately enable the patient to get better. Like, All right. But even more fundamentally, it will be optimally stressful input from the outside, and the patient's evolving capacity to process, integrate, and adapt to the impact of this stressful input that will ultimately trigger the patient's recovery by tapping into the patient's underlying resilience, innate striving toward health, and intrinsic capacity to self-correct or self-right in the face of optimal challenge. So here we go, this slide, important. By repeatedly generating, strategically, optimally stressful growth incentivizing mismatch experiences between old defensive bad and new adaptive good, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic psychotherapy affords the patient both impetus and opportunity, albeit belatedly after the fact, to master traumatic relational experiences that had once been overwhelming and therefore defended against because it was too much for the little child to manage, to handle. And so they defended in order to survive. But that can now, within the context of the therapeutic relationship, be revisited, relived, reactivated, re-experienced, reprocessed, grieved, and reframed, recontextualized, such that growth impeding, old bad, rigid defenses, once necessary for survival, can be incrementally, gradually, progressively transformed into growth promoting, new good, resilient adaptations. And I promise I'm going to be giving examples down the road. I promise. I'm just giving you the overview now. Indeed, from psychological rigidity to psychological resilience, and stronger at the broken places. And think of that little mouse. Defense becoming adaptation. Not adaptation instead of defense, but rather the defense itself becoming adaptation, as stressors, once traumatic, are reworked and rendered now optimal. Or as the Beatles sing, take a sad song and make it better. It's not like create a whole nother song. It's take a sad song and make it better. And that's what we're doing. And I have other sides later, but I think I have. Yes, I'll get to that in a moment. But so, and it's the short-term intensive psychodynamic folks that their models sort of informed my model 5, my quantum neuroscientific approach, that helped me to understand that that the problem always holds elements of its solution. I mean, that is so profound. You have to think about that. The problem always holds elements of its solution. So, I mean, I'll give you an example, actually. On Thursday, I did my spot supervision Zoom session, per my usual. I was fine. It was all good. Overnight, Thursday night, I got sick. I don't usually get sick, actually, but I did. And Friday, I awakened and I had quite a fever. I had quite a fever. I didn't feel very good. I had a sore throat. I had congestion in my lungs. I was like coughing. I didn't feel good. Fortunately, I didn't really have to work much on Friday. I mean, I kind of did, but I was able to put that aside. So I just really took care of myself. I did not take anything, any antipyretic to get rid of the fever, but I let the fever, which was a symptom, which was part of the problem because I felt that I was burning up inside. I lay in bed. I even wore a bathrobe and put on extra blankets, and I'm like sweating, and I'm like, and my dear sweet gunner saying, "Oh my God, it's like an oven in here." And they're like, "Well, whatever. I'm trying to burn out the microbes or whatever." And I spent the day Friday sort of in bed and burning out the bad thing inside of me, and went to sleep Friday night in hot sweat, and whatever, and awakened Saturday morning, this morning, and quite frankly, I feel great. The problem always holds elements of the solution. Well, you'd say, well, that's just one problem. Is it always the case? Well, I'm going to say yes. I'll give you one other example for now. For example, many of us therapists, maybe when we were younger, we had some experiences, some traumatic experiences, maybe little T traumas, maybe big T traumas, but we had things. And most of us hopefully have been in therapy and hopefully had some good experiences in therapy, some maybe little T transformations and some big T transformations, such that we are now healthier and more evolved and more mindful and more thoughtful and more considered and more reflective. And we're now therapists and we help others. So our problems early on it inspired us as we were working them through, inspired us to become clinicians able to help others with their problems. That's another example of every problem holds elements of its solution. Anyway, take a sad song and make it better. So as stressors once traumatic, which then gave rise to defensive reactions in order to survive, as those are reworked within the context of the treatment and rendered now more optimal, that means then that what had once been a defensive reaction, that will be morphed into an adaptive response to what is now an optimal, experienced as an optimal stressor. And let me see. Well, I'll get to, yeah, my order. I should have done the order a little differently. I think for now we'll just go with this, and I promise I'll say a little more later. So the moment of transformation exists as potential until the choice is made, choice, to reframe once traumatic growth impeding stressors that gave rise to growth impeding defenses, reframe them as now optimal growth promoting challenges that will stimulate the emergence of growth promoting adaptations. So it's sort of like the thing that was there has been transformed and recontextualized and reworked from traumatic to optimal. It's the same thing. Here's an example. A woman came my way for a consultation, and she'd met a handsome fellow at a party, and almost against her better judgment, but she decided when he offered her a ride home that sort of like, okay, thank you, I'd appreciate that. So she got in his truck, and they're chatting, whatever, and before long she realizes that he has driven her into the woods, and he proceeds to try to rape her. This was some years earlier, and she came to me because of some PTSD that she had developed as a result of the near rape. Now, as it turns out, she had managed to fight him off and somehow leapt out of the truck, ran through the woods to safety, and indeed was not raped. But as we talked about it, and it usually doesn't, and we didn't get it all done, but as we talked about it, it became clear that there near rape, which had been experienced by her as traumatic, and she was hating herself for her bad judgment, and that she had let herself get sort of seduced by this charming, handsome young fellow against her better judgment, as we began to realize that her capacity to survive and her ability to use her smarts and her strength and so on to leap out of the truck and run for safety. So it was the same thing, but instead of experiencing it as a traumatic thing that made her feel horrible about herself, we began to reframe it as, also there was some grieving in there, reframe it as something that spoke to her resilience and her capacity to thrive. So it's very interesting. The same thing can be looked at. It's the observer's perspective, in a way, the quantum theory, the observer's perspective, and the uncertainty principle, and a couple other things. I think I'll get to those slides, but eventually. Said Freud, out of your vulnerabilities will come your strength. That Freud, I mean, no dummy he. Okay, so both simple, oh, here it is. Both simple and profound is this compelling idea that deep embodied treatments have the power to reconfigure the past and thereby to transform the future as rigid defense evolves into more resilient adaptation. In essence, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic psychotherapy is a story about reshaping the past to make new futures possible. In the strange and counterintuitive world of quantum physics, and I don't begin to understand the quantum realm, but I understand a little bit of it. And it's pretty cool what I do understand of it. This riveting idea that the present has the power to rewrite the past and thereby to change the future, which is what we do in deep embodied treatments, is referred to as retrocausation. Who knew? And parenthetically, transformation of or evolving of a sad song into making it better, traumatic stressor into optimal stressor, again, at the heart of the therapeutic action in deep treatments, this is a powerful demonstration of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, namely the quantum fact that uncertainty is built into reality itself. That's exactly what we're talking about when we do deep embodied work as clinicians. Nothing is sort of like objectively true, but rather different ways to look at things. That's what we're talking about here. And the observer effect in action, the quantum fact that merely observing something inevitably disturbs it. Two things are never the very same. They're ever busy evolving and continuously shifting because we are different at a later moment in time when we're looking at something that had happened that we had looked at the day before. Interesting. Here, oh, I'm trying to figure out if it's half full or half empty. I'm trying to figure out if it's an adaptation, half full, or a defense, half empty. Okay, I find it useful to call upon the Mobius strip. My dear sweet Gunnar made this for me as a conceptual model for understanding the quantic relationship between defense and adaptation. The Mobius strip is a continuous, non-dual surface where what seems like one side and the other side, that would be dual, but are actually part of the same unbroken topology. It's non-dual. It's just one surface. Defense and adaptation are not separate states, but different expressions of the same underlying continuum, like particle and wave in the quantum realm. a transformation in form without a break in continuity. That's what we're doing with our patients. The transformation of defense into adaptation is not a leap from one thing to another, but a seamless morphing along the same surface, a twist in the strip where inside becomes outside and protection becomes growth. Self-protection becomes growth. And I mean, you could spend hours just meditating on this Mobius strip, and you just like follow it around. And it's like, oh my God, you cover every aspect of it without having lifted your finger off of it even once. Mind-boggling. And in Greg Braden's words, he wrote The Divine Matrix. I have that over there on my bookshelf. Quantum science suggests the existence of many possible futures for each moment of our lives. Each future lies in a state of rest until it is awakened by choices, intentional choices, intentionality, the power of intentionality made in the present. I mean, I find that just so uplifting. I mean, we can't just completely change everything, but by golly, we can sure take ownership of the power of our commitment to making our lives better or more manageable, or to figuring out a way to deal with all the stressors that come our way. Okay, here we go. The Stark method, yes. So this lovely compass, Synergy, I love this. I paid $35 to Shutterstock, and I bought this. And then I figured out that I could put a star in the place of, so get some use for the last name of Stark. I've never loved that last name specifically, but I can put the word star in there instead of the A. I figured that out just recently. So it becomes the Stark method of psychodynamic synergy, or Stark synergy. All right, so briefly, I wanted the next 5 slides are about the Stark method of psychodynamic synergy. For some of you, it's sort of like, huh? And for others of you, it's sort of like, oh, yeah, good. Hope this is a good repeat, because it's always good. It's complicated stuff, and it's good to kind of get a refresher. I even learn a whole lot each time I present. All right, Model 1, classical psychoanalytic. Now we're talking about structural conflict, neurotic conflict, intrapsychic conflict, inner conflict, inner turmoil, civil war, or, and this is where I do use some diagnostic words a little bit, neurotic conflictedness. Yeah, neurotic conflict. Now, again, I want to highlight here, Model 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, speak to different aspects of all of us. We all have elements that are neurotic, all elements that are narcissistic, all of us have elements that are noxious in our relatedness, all of us have elements that are affectively non-related, in the words of Arne Modell, and all of us non-action, non-actualization. All of us have this. It's not, I mean, though there may be a predominance of one, and often people will look at this, my students will, or my patients who might know about this will say, oh, well, yeah, I'm probably, certainly for now and for the foreseeable future, I'm a Model 3 type. You know, I'm noxious in my relatedness. I have other issues, but I just get caught up in really contentious relationships with everybody, and it ends up a mess, all my relationships. I really might as well just live solo. Or some people will say, oh my God, you know, I do well with people, but I'm so internally conflicted and jammed up, and my superego kicks in and it says all the time I'm not good enough and I'm bad, and so on and so forth. So people, when I introduced Model 4, people would email me and say like, oh my God, you're talking about me, Model 4, the existential humanistic perspective of schizoid retreat and existential despair and feeling alienated and dissociated from the world. So like, oh, wow. And all of us have elements of all of this. Okay, Model 1, the interpretive perspective of classical psychoanalysis. I learned about this in the 70s at the Boston Psychoanalytic when I was doing my psychoanalytic training. It took me a decade to develop each of these. 1970s, neurotic conflictedness, the neurotic. I should be saying the patient with neurotic features. You don't just type class the person as the kidney, the heart disease, the arthritic, or the neurotic, but the patient with neurotic issues. But I'm going to say the neurotic for the purposes of the slide. Model 2, the deficiency compensation or corrective provision perspective of self-psychology. I learned about this in the 80s. Structural or self self-deficit, an impaired capacity to be a good parent, caregiver unto oneself. Impaired capacity, a deficit, defective capacity to be self-esteem regulating, or as it's often called, self-regulating, self-deficit, self-defects. Very different from neurotic. Neurotic conflictedness is what's going on inside. Often a conflict between defiance on the one hand and compliance on the other. Can I defy or must I comply? Can I be bad or must I be good? So this internal civil war, neurotic conflictedness, where it could be on an island. The example I always give is nobody else is around. You're on an island and you're neurotically jammed up about whether or not you're allowed to masturbate or not. And that's an internal something. It used to be messages that came from the outside, but now you're on the island, you've lived there for years, and you're still conflicted about whether or not you get to masturbate or not. That captures it best. Model 1. Model 2, you're busy needing and wanting input, self-esteem, narcissistic supplies, goodies, gratification from the outside because you have a self-deficit. Narcissistic woundedness giving rise to narcissistic vulnerability, and you have narcissistic features. Okay. Model 3, the intersubjective perspective, intersubjective to subjects, authentic subjects in relationship, of contemporary relational theory. I learned about this in the 90s, the folk at the William Allenson White Institute. And this is, I got to have an N word. You'll notice these are N words. So I'm going to say, I should have said contentious relatedness, but I'm going to say noxious relatedness, whereas in model 1, it'd be more about projection. In model 3, it's about projective identification, and you're drawing the therapist into participating with you in your compulsive and unwitting reenactment of unmastered early on relational traumas on the stage of the treatment and in your life on the outside. Projective identification involving patient and therapist, two-person approach to dealing with these charged toxic boluses that have been interjected from the outside. So relational conflict, Stephen Mitchell's term, and many others since, noxious relatedness, and now we talk about someone with character disordered features or borderline features. Okay, model 4. So this one I always have to say, Larry Hedges made me add model 4. And because of my friend Larry Hedges, and because of it, my whole model is so much better. But I did fight it rigidly for a number of years before I finally, I mean, Larry just said, I'm not going to let you get out of the car as he dropped me off at LAX. I'd given a talk there, a 6-hour talk that day. Not going to let you out of the car until you agree to putting model 4 into your model. And so you'd have structural conflict, structural deficit, relational conflict, and relational deficit. And so, you know, what can you say? I mean, I had to get out of the car and get back home to Boston. So anyway, I came up with Model 4, and thank you, Larry. And you know, I feel I almost have to apologize to all of my patients prior to my introducing from 2000 to 2010, my Model 4 of an existential humanistic approach to healing brokenness. This model is the one that invites patients to regress so that they're regress to redo, a reset, so that there can be the emergence of Ofra Eshel's, she's an Israeli psychoanalyst, analytic oneness, or a regressing to harmonious interpenetrating mix-up between patient and therapist, in the words of Michael Ballant, or blissful, peaceful merger with another between the patient and the therapist. That's Model 4. And I think of it as helping the patient overcome, this is Masood Khan, overcome their dread of surrender to resourceless or existential dependence on another. Model 4, that's what Model 4 is about. So this would have been non-relatedness, there's your N word, the schizoid, the addict, the outlier, the person with neurodivergence. And again, they have other features too, but many of them will simply say, oh my God, you know, I got my sex addiction and also food addicted, and that's very private matter. And quite frankly, Model 4 is where I am primarily, although I certainly do other stuff too. Then Model 5, and that came along 2010 to 2020, my Model 5, quantum, neuroscientific. And now we're talking about neural entrenchment and non-action, analysis paralysis. When in those moments in a treatment where patient and therapist get it that they're stuck, they might want to introduce a little bit of Model 5. But my talk today isn't on that. You'll have to come back in October to hear me a little bit more talking about memory is, and also next April for the Center for Christianity and Psychoanalysis, to talk about memory is a verb, not a noun. Model 5, that's Model 5. But anyway, here we have individuals who are in a state of paralysis, tethered to their traumatic past, trapped in implicitly held, like deep down, the undertow, I call it the undertow. And my patients now often say, well, the undertow reared its ugly head. Old, bad, embodied, it's a body thing, memories, narratives, deeply ingrained procedural, limiting beliefs, and conditioned neural entrenchment relational expectations. So Model 5 addresses itself specifically to old bad narratives, emotional learnings, relational expectations, conditioned, neurally entrenched. Embodied memories, narratives. That's their language. But again, it's the same person. But now in Model 5, we're more likely to talk about little t and big T traumas in a way that we wouldn't be as likely to talk about it in Models 1, 2, 3, 4. It's just different languaging. Same patient, different languaging. Okay, here's another one. So I would like to suggest that the Stark method of psychodynamic synergy is a CARES approach to deep embodied healing. CARES, C, cognitive, privilege is thinking. Privilege is sort of a fancy-dancy sort of word. You kind of brag when you use the word privileges, but it is kind of relevant here. Cognitive, Model 1, privilege is thinking. Think classical psychoanalytic, and ultimately insight or awareness. Model 2, privilege is affect or emotion or feeling. So it's affective. Model 3, when we're talking about the here and now engagement between patient and therapist, it privileges enactments, or more accurately, reenactments. So it's relational. How are we doing here? CAR. Okay, Model 4. Existential. Oh, good. Privileges, the search for meaning. The search for meaning. Model 5. Quantum neuroscientific. Well, synaptic. Okay, neuroscientific. Or if we're going to focus in on the quantum, how about superpositional? If we want to get fancy-dancy. So here, this one privileges traumatic embodied memories and deeply entrenched narratives that become the disempowering and distorted narratives through which the patient experiences self, others, and the world. Or superpositional, when we're talking in quantum terms, the simultaneous existence, hearkening back to Greg Braden's quote and what we were talking about with retrocausation, superpositional, the simultaneous existence of multiple possible states. So here we are in the here and now, but there's the possibility of new good for the future as we lean into the edge between the present and the future, the old bad that was and the new good that could be. It's still us, but we can transform because every moment holds a pluripotent potential. Pluripotent. I want to say that word. I should get that in there. Pluripotent potential. It's like a stem cell. Oh, that's good. Like a stem cell. I got to get that in there. Okay, good. All right, moving on. So agents for transformation, the catalyst for change. There's that word catalyst. Okay, Model 1, I've kind of been saying it, interpreting. It's what the therapist does. It's a little more cognitive, right? To resolve the structural conflict. That's what we're going to be focusing on here. Model 2, I mean, empathic attunement is sort of backdrop for everything, for the holding. But Model 2, more specifically, the self-psychological approach to resolve self or structural deficit, impaired capacity to be a good parent unto oneself, will be to facilitate the patient's grieving. And the cool thing about grieving, there's more self-psychological. Not all self-psychologists promote this, but plenty of them do. And the idea being that as you grieve, as you confront and grieve unbearably painful realities about the objects of your desire, and you confront it and grieve it, you evolve ultimately to a place of acceptance by way of adaptive transmuting, which means structure building, internalizations of the capacities or the functions that had been performed by the self-object therapist prior to their disillusionment of the patient. So grieving is the therapeutic agent. Grieving, optimal disillusionment, thereby filling in deficit. I know I said a whole lot there, but that is actually the therapeutic action in Model 2. Grieving, okay, whew. Okay, Model 3, negotiating. I'd already kind of hinted at projective identification, doer and done to, Jessica Benjamin, Darlene Ehrenberg's Intimate Edge, negotiating the inherent messiness, that's Ed Tronick and Claudia Gold, that will inevitably emerge at the intimate edge, Darlene Ehrenberg, of authentic relatedness and a negotiating of it. I think of it as a ping pong game being played by the patient and the therapist, with both starting with a ball, boom, 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 and negotiating that. It's pretty intense. It can be very intense. A lot of therapists avoid it like the plague. All right, but that's the way in which charged toxic boluses of internal bad objects or pathogenic introjects can be delivered into the relationship and reworked within the context of the relationship by way of working through transference, countertransference, entanglements, mutual enactment, projective identifications. Okay. Model 4, a la Masood Khan, as I mentioned earlier, surrendering, facilitating the patient's surrender to existential dependence on another, to resolve relational deficit, for them to have the experience of primary trust and a regression to redo, a benign regression, a scalar energy reset, so they can start over again, a new beginning. We think Winnicott, we think Ballant, we think Guntrip. You think Guntrip. We would have thought Fairbairn, but we don't. We think Fairbairn for Model 3. We don't think Fairbairn for Model 4. Now that we've thought about it, we think Fairbairn for Model 3. Anyway, Model 5, quantum neuroscientific. I couldn't decide which I wanted, so I put in all three. Disentangling, rescripting, and updating. And now we're talking about narratives and storylines and emotional learnings and limiting beliefs to resolve psychic inertia, where we're juxtaposing the old bad that was with the new envisioned good that could be. There we go. All right, this is a complicated slide. I don't know that we need to get into this. I guess I'll read one or two little things from it, because all 5 of them involve creating prototypical statements. I mean, I didn't always have these statements, but people would say, well, you know, it's fine, these 5 models, but how exactly should I, as the therapist, when I'm thinking, oh, okay, this is Model 2, there needs to be grieving, or this Model 3, there needs to be a sort of negotiating at our intimate edge, or Model 4, I need to sort of deal with the fact that they've retreated on me, and so on. How about some prototypical statements that I can have in the back of my mind to introduce at such moments? All right, so Model 1 conflict statements to facilitate the interpretation of internal discord. Tame the id and strengthen the ego. Where id was, there shall ego be. Disillusionment statements, Model 2, to facilitate the grieving of painful disillusionment, from unmastered relational heartbreak to sober, mature acceptance of unbearable realities. Model 3, to facilitate the negotiation of relational discord, not internal discord, the person masturbating or not on the island, but the negotiation of relational discord, the noxious relatedness that's being delivered into one's relationships, from the experience of self as victim to relational accountability and empowerment. Because when you hold yourself accountable for that that's going not right for you in relationships, then you can resolve, as best you can anyway, to do it a little differently going forward. There's always the undertow, so it's not as easy as that necessarily, but it's an important first step towards empowerment. Holding oneself accountable, relationally accountable, is a first step towards empowerment. Model 4, facilitation statements. Facilitate existential surrender to Ofra Echel's analytic oneness, from alienation and despair to moments of meeting and reclaiming of life. And Model 5, quantum disentanglement statements. These are the only ones that patient and therapist work on together. They co-create these statements to facilitate energetic decoupling from a traumatic, immobilizing past, replete with little t and big T traumas. So from relinquishing of old bad narratives to embracing of new good ones. Okay, moving on from structural conflict, my eyes on the time, to structural collaboration. Let me do this real quick. Now, Freud's pre-structural bipartite model of the mind, bipartite meaning two, conceived of neurotic conflict, model one, neurotic conflict, as a story about tension, Civil War tension between an anxiety-provoking, dysregulated id drive and an anxiety assuaging, self-protective ego defense. The defense mobilized by an undeveloped ego made anxious in the face of the threatened breakthrough of an unruly id impulse. Freud employed his famous horse and rider metaphor to illustrate the process of working through. I actually don't have it on this slide. I should have, but in his on remembering, repeating, and working through in 1914, on remembering, repeating, and working through, 1914, I believe, whereby his metaphor, horse and rider, the id horse is tamed and the ego rider is strengthened. But as genuine adaptive solutions begin to emerge, said he, more evolved, more viable options, the need for defensive strategies, reining the horse in, gradually diminishes. And this will give way to a transformative process described in classical psychoanalytic literature as working through the resistance. And those are two books there. And I get to name this, no conflict of interest here because they're both free. I wrote two books on working with the resistance. One is called Working with the Resistance, and the other is called A Primer on Working with the Resistance. And they're two separate e-books, and they're free. They're free. You just email me and I'll send them to you. Okay. More specifically, and this bears sharing with you because this was Freud at his best, he actually talking about the working through process. Initially, Freud's inexperienced rider and undeveloped ego will be made anxious by her untamed horse, a dysregulated id, which will prompt the rider to rein her horse in defensively. The ego, in other words, to mobilize its defenses to put a lid on the id initially. But as a result of training of both the rider and the horse, and working through by both the therapist and the patient, Freud's now more experienced and more empowered rider, a now stronger and more insightful ego, will be now better able to manage her now tamer horse, a now better regulated and more adaptable id. Indeed, as a result of this training, this working through, whereby the horse, the id, is tamed, and the rider, the ego, is strengthened, the defensive need to rein the horse in gradually gives way to the adaptive capacity to give the horse free rein and skillfully to harness its power so that its now modulated energy can be channeled into healthier pursuits and more constructive endeavors. Think Freud's sublimation. A masterfully skilled, precision-driven surgeon now, who was once a young child playing recklessly with knives. There are two, that the problem always holds elements of its solution. Horse and rider will now be able, as a result of the horse, the id, tamed, the rider, the ego, strengthened, horse and rider will now be able to move forward, therapist and patient, patient and therapist, to move forward harmoniously and in sync. And I know you can feel this in your work with patients. I know I did as a patient in my therapy, where instead of there being conflict, there could now be sort of like, yeah, much more freedom. No longer in conflict between, a civil war inside, or even sometimes played out in the arena, but in collaboration with. So not conflict between, but in collaboration with. Because what was once neurotically jammed up has now evolved into something freer and more expansive. So here we go. Carl Jung's lovely quote. I just love this one. Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. You don't get rid of something, but rather you integrate what had been tension between, you integrate the contraries. And every problem holds elements of its solution. I can certainly sort of resonate with that gal at her laptop, like, within the very structure of a problem lie the catalysts needed for its eventual resolution, but only if those problematic elements can be identified, examined, and worked through. Okay, now, Freud's original drive, defense, conflict, those three words, drive, defense, conflict model. That's what I was taught in the 1970s when I was doing my psychoanalytic training at the Boston Psychoanalytic, which was rooted in Freud's earlier bipartite two modes, two agencies of the mind. In other words, id and ego, conceptualized psychopathology, neurotic conflict, as resulting from internal tension between a dysregulated id impulse and an ego defense. An ego made anxious by the threatened breakthrough of an id impulse. And his horse and rider metaphor that I just developed for you, or repeated for you, speaks to that very thing. So a dysregulated id impulse and an ego defense. But with Freud's later development of his tripartite model, in other words, now he said there are three psychic agencies: id, ego, and superego, superego being a latecomer. Now, again, how do we know what's really going on inside? PET scans and CAT scans and stuff like that. I mean, SPECT scans, they don't really show these things. It's all kind of made up anyway. But he felt he had evolved to a place where it made more sense for him, both as a result of his clinical work and theoretically, to think in terms of three agencies: id and ego, yes, and also superego. So with his later development of his three parts model, classical conflict, he reframed as resulting from internal tension between, and look closely or you'll miss it, a dysregulated id impulse, same thing as before, and now not an ego defense, but rather a punitive superego injunction, with the beleaguered ego striving to mediate between force and counterforce in an effort to regulate intrapsychic tension and restore psychic equilibrium. Indeed, to be more technically precise, neurotic conflict might now be more aptly described as a drive prohibition conflict model, not drive defense conflict model, which speaks to the ego, but rather a drive prohibition conflict, which speaks to the superego, which wasn't around in Freud's earlier bipartite formulation of conflict. But here, with the ego functioning, not only, let me just do something. The ego functioning not only as the mediator, but also as the arena in which the struggle is being played out. So now, from an id drive ego defense conflict model, in keeping with Freud's earlier bipartite model of the mind, to an id drive superego prohibition conflict model, in keeping with Freud's later tripartite model of the mind. Okay, now building on Freud's classical formulations of intrapsychic tension, period, I have found it clinically a little more useful to broaden his traditional and still clinically relevant conflict model. So I'm leaping off of what he provided with his brilliant idea of intrapsychic neurotic conflict, whether it's between id and ego defense or id and superego injunction, but the idea of that kind of civil war going on. My Model 1 conflict statements recast neurotic conflict as speaking not simply to a clash between impulse and constraining demand, whether from the ego or the superego, but more expansively to a state of internal dividedness between two poles. It's a little different here, between two poles. Now I'm going to define the two poles. On the one hand, anxiety provoking forces, pressing yes. And yeah, you can think about it if you want. Anxiety provoking forces pressing yes, which once accessed, modulated, and made more manageable, will become growth promoting and empowering. Once their energy has been harnessed, they've been tamed and modified, and their energy has been harnessed, eventually fueling the patient's momentum, providing the propulsive fuel for the patient's forward movement. And on the other hand, anxiety assuaging counter forces mobilize, insisting no, and mobilized in response to, and I should be writing that, mobilized in response to, or maybe it's actually in reaction to, mobilized in reaction to. I guess it could be in response to or in reaction to. I have to think about that. I'll think about it. So just mobilized. As a counter forces, as a counter to the anxiety provoking forces insisting yes. Okay, we'll go with that. So anxiety provoking forces pressing yes, which once worked through, tamed, modified, become growth promoting and empowering. This is Model 1. This is what we're talking about here, eventually fueling the patient's forward movement. And on the other hand, and this is the enemy, anxiety assuaging counter forces insisting no, defensive, resistant counter forces, which as long as they remain unnamed, sort of part of the undertow, unexamined, and unchallenged, will be growth impeding and disempowering, consequently thwarting the patient's potential. So that's what we're talking about with neurotic conflict. That's what we're talking about when the patient is jammed up. And we all know, we have friends, we have colleagues, we have our patients who just like, my God, just do it. You know, the Nike thing, just do it. But if you're all neurotically conflicted and jammed up, you can't just do it. Or if you're on the islands, can I masturbate or not? Like, just do it. I mean, you know, like whatever, just go for it. But they're like, oh, no, 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 no. There are these resistant defensive counter forces that say, oh, no, 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 that thwart the patient's potential. Okay, now, indeed. Whew, all right, that felt good. That slide was important, slide 62. I mean, slide 47. Huh. Who knew? All right, I got to change this slide number. Something went wrong. All right. Indeed, most patients are conflicted about most things most of the time, including, of course, about getting better, letting go of old bad, and embracing new good. Model 1 conflict statements are therefore universally applicable interventions that target these states of internal dividedness or conflictedness. So in your own selves, what are you conflicted about, jammed up about? It's not about anyone else, only you suffer. It's like, oh my God, what should I do with the rest of my day? Oh, do I get to watch TV or not? Oh my God, should I watch it again? Oh, when should I go to bed? Oh, can I this? Can I that? Should I eat the dessert? Should I not? Should I maybe this? Do I call my friend? Do I not? Do I do my taxes? All these, can I finish my dissertation? All of these things doesn't bother anyone else, but you're neurotically conflicted and jammed up. Think about it. Do you have some of those? God knows. I do, even though I got a lot of work done in my therapy, and then my training analysis, nonetheless, still have some of these. So by speaking simultaneously, though, conflict statements to both the patient's defensive need to remain true to old bad, which is a right brain mediated position rooted in emotional survival and shaped by early relational experience, right brain, emotional, relational, right brain, and the patient's adaptive capacity to begin over time to recognize and reflect upon more mindfully the price paid for that defensive investment. The analytic wisdom of the left brain, the rational emotional wisdom, the relational emotional wisdom of the right brain. So here, and the patient's adaptive capacity to begin to recognize and reflect upon the price paid for that defensive investment, a left brain mediated function that will evolve through repeated engagement with the very conflict statements that are calling it forth. Now, I might have thrown you off a little bit because I think I said I confused myself even. Right brain is emotional relational, and left brain is analytic. Right brain is emotional, relational, more past oriented right brain. Left brain is analytic wisdom and more present and future oriented. So I'm sorry if I confused you and or myself on that. Okay, so model one, the interpretive perspective. Conflict statements are designed not only to make explicit both sides of the neurotic conflict, but also to juxtapose those two sides in a way that creates an optimally stressful, growth incentivizing mismatch experience. Think of those two shoes that are mismatched in my earlier slide. This dialectical tension that emerges between the patient's adaptive capacity to acknowledge an anxiety provoking, but once worked through, ultimately growth promoting psychological truth, whether about the price paid for staying loyal to old bad or the enlivening possibility of moving toward new good, and her defensive need, anxiety assuaging, but growth impeding, to resist acknowledging that truth because facing it stirs too much anxiety. So the dialectical tension between adaptive capacity, left brain, and defensive need, right brain. In other words, conflict, that's not even a full sentence. Anyway, conflict between the adaptive capacity to face and the defensive need to flee, but also to juxtapose those two sides in a way that creates. The dialectical tension emerges between, there is a sentence, between adaptive capacity and defensive need. And conflict statements do indeed, with a comma in the middle, though you don't have to say the comma to the patient, but you can think the comma, between initially the adaptive anxiety-provoking capacity whereby you name what they do know. And on the other hand, you resonate empathically what they find themselves defensively thinking, needing, thinking, feeling, or doing in order not to have to know. I'm easing you towards the prototypical conflict statement, what's involved. Here it is. Oh, thank goodness. In other words, Model 1 conflict statements are thoughtfully crafted to encourage the resistant, defensive patient to step back from the immediacy of the moment in order to become aware of. So it's about awareness, right? Insight into the dividedness within her between an anxiety-provoking psychic truth that will ultimately be in her best interest adaptively to acknowledge, even though doing so will initially evoke anxiety, and the way she then defensively positions herself so as not to have to know that truth, because allowing it into consciousness would feel too overwhelming. Now, let me say something here that I'm going to emphasize a little bit more later. This defense arises only because of the first half. When we highlight what on some level she does know to be a psychological truth, that indeed she's conflicted about her relationships with other women, or she would just as soon do away with her mother, or she quite frankly would really love to win out over her sister in terms of her father's affection. So that there, on some level, she does kind of know, or her attachment still to her father is what gets in the way of her wanting to be sexually involved with her husband, whatever. So that psychological truth, the undertow that sort of is there, the second part is the defensive reaction to the fact of the first part. If the first part weren't there, there wouldn't be the need for the second part. I don't know if I said that real clearly. I'll say it a little more better later, I hope. All right. So the prototypical conflict statement, you adaptively know that, but you, made anxious, find yourself defensively thinking, feeling, or doing in order not to have to know. So you do know that, but you, made anxious, find yourself thinking, feeling, or doing in order not to have to know. With the therapist's finger, again, ever on the pulse of the patient's anxiety and capacity to tolerate further challenge, the therapist will, whenever possible, alternately and repeatedly challenge the defense, you know that, by directing the patient's attention to where the patient isn't in the moment, but to where the therapist would want the patient to go. I mean, it can't be just totally out in left field, but something that the patient sort of has intimated in her time, but not fully embraced. But, you have some sense that the patient does on some level kind of know it, though it makes her anxious to sort of think about it for too long. And so she doesn't like to talk about it. So by directing the patient's attention to where the patient isn't, but to where the therapist would want the patient to go, namely to a healthier, albeit anxiety-provoking place. That's disruptive attunement. And then support the defense. But you find yourself thinking, feeling, or doing in order not to have to know. And here you are going to resonate empathically with where the patient is. It doesn't mean agreeing with them and saying, yep, good that you're doing that. It's not about you. You've decentered from your judgment, your subjectivity, your biases, and you're joining alongside the patient and just simply deeply understanding. Vicarious introspection, empathically immersing yourself in their experience and getting it, why they feel as they do. Namely, you resonate empathically with where the patient is, namely in a less healthy, albeit anxiety assuaging place. And that's called homeostatic attunement. Again, thank you, Jim Herzog and Salman Akhtar. Okay, in essence, conflict statements interpret the patient's internal conflictedness, right, between two poles, civil war, by highlighting both sides of her dividedness with an eye to making explicit, right, the undertow explicit, the left brain, right brain conflict within her, the civil war. On the one hand, the anxiety-provoking, but ultimately growth-promoting, left brain-mediated adaptive capacity to know what is true, in conflict with the anxiety-assuaging and self-protective, but growth-impeding, right brain-mediated defensive need to resist knowing. Oh, here's some examples. Oh, thank goodness. Optimally stressful Model 1 conflict statements. You know that if you're ever to get on with your life, you'll have to let go of your conviction that your childhood scarred you forever. Do they know that? Yeah, they know that. That's what you and they have been talking about for a very long time now. By your saying it to them in that way, does it make them anxious? Yeah. Does that mean like, oh my God, that's terrible, you made your patient anxious? No, because now in the second part after the comma, although I see there's a period there, but after the comma, you're going to resonate empathically with that there that they find themselves doing in order not to have to be sitting for too long with that anxiety-provoking knowledge. So you're creating increase anxiety, decrease anxiety. At the end of your optimally stressful conflict statement, you are you're creating a mismatch experience, the working through of which the internal tension caused by that will result ultimately over time by way of a series of these in advancing from defensive need to resist to adaptive capacity to be aware. And in the awareness is more empowerment. Um, Knowledge, Sir Francis Bacon said, right? Knowledge is power. Knowledge itself is power. Now, I think we've found that knowledge alone doesn't always do it, but it's certainly an important first step, which is why many people, whether it's Habib Davanloo, who went on to do his ISTDP, right, who had trained, become an analyst in Boston, but for him that wasn't quite enough, so he went on to develop ISTDP, which is a brilliant something. And all of us have found, for the most part, that being strictly Model 1 doesn't always quite get it done. So you want to have a sort of combination of things here. A synergy of things, you might even say. You might say stark synergy. You might say that. All right. Anyway, that was just the first half. Let me reread the first half. You know that if you're ever to get on with your life, you'll have to let go of your conviction that your childhood scarred you forever. This to a patient who has said, I am just simply so damaged because of all of what I had to suffer as a kid. I had a patient who said that just the other day. I am so damaged. I don't believe that I can ever really move forward. Okay. But eventually, to get on with your life, you're going to have to get over your conviction that your childhood scarred you irreparably forever. But now we resonate without judgment, with compassion. But it's hard not to feel like damaged goods. When you grew up in a horribly abusive household with a mean and nasty mother who kept telling you that you were a loser. And they almost start crying. Yes, right. And you're contextualizing, eventually recontextualizing all sorts of things for them. But for now, you're contextualizing why it is that they feel so damaged and feel that they've been scarred for life. You get a lot done. And so how do they respond? They can either pick up on, yeah, I know. And the more left brain, yeah, I know, I really need to let go of that, or how can I expect to be able to move forward? Or they may say, yeah, I mean, what am I supposed to do? I mean, all I was told was you're a loser, you'll never make it, you're a failure. If you got an A on your report card, it's that because you cheated off of someone else, and so on. So they can go on to elaborate upon either, but notice either side. Notice that I've added the words, you know that. And we'll get into that in a second, but you know that. I'm highlighting what they know. Civil War. I'm not saying that I know. I'm saying you know. You know. Okay? You're coming to understand that your anger can put people off. I say that because, quite frankly, they have acknowledged that they do know that, quite frankly, they're experienced as a very angry person, and that can be very off-putting for people. But you tell yourself that you have a right to be as angry as you want because of how much you've had to suffer over the years. And they feel deeply understood. You understand why I feel that way. But you've also gotten in that early part, you're coming to understand that your anger can put people off. Well, yeah, there is that, and that's the downside, and so on. Okay, here's one. You know that if your relationship with Alana is to survive, you'll need to take at least some responsibility for the part you're playing in the incredibly abusive fights that the two of you have been having. Yeah, they know that. I mean, they're not an idiot. Yeah, okay, all right. If it's to survive, I mean, I guess maybe I played a little part. She was 90%, I was 10%, but you need to take at least some responsibility, said I. I'm not going to say I have to take all the responsibility. I said some of the responsibility for the part you're playing in the incredibly abusive fights, because they've come in and told us about how they're at each other's throats, that the two of you have been having. But here's the defensive reaction that kicks in reaction. I guess it is reaction, not response. Reaction, defensive reaction, right? Defensive reaction to that first part. But you tell yourself that it isn't really your fault, because if she weren't so provocative, then you wouldn't have to be so vindictive. And they'd say, right, you are, right, exactly. Right. Although I do know. And then they can go on and say, although I do know that, we can't just keep doing this. We've been fighting like this, for years, and it's exhausting both of us, and we've broken up a million times. And I know that we've got to figure out, right, blah, 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 blah. Okay, finally, you know that someday you'll have to let somebody in if you're ever to have a meaningful relationship. But in the moment, the thought of do they know that? Yes, like, duh. They have to let somebody in if they're ever to have a meaningful relationship. I mean, this is not rocket science. But now notice, I didn't say you're going to have to let somebody in if you're ever to have a meaningful relationship. I said, I also put in that word that someday. I didn't even want to be in their face with, you need to do it now, but sort of like, that someday You'll have to let somebody in if you're ever to have a meaningful relationship. I don't want there to be a conflict between us where I say, you're going to have to let somebody in if you're ever to have a meaningful relationship. And then they say, no, no, but it's just too scary. No, no. Oh, yes, 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 you need to. Oh, no, no, I don't want to. In a conflict statement, you get both sides named and you put it where it belongs, which is the civil war in the patient. But in the moment, the thought of making yourself that vulnerable is simply intolerable. Out of the question. There's no way you're willing to run the risk of being hurt ever again, where you're referencing the fact that you know their father had broken their heart, then their first husband had broken their heart, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now, in essence, by the way, dual awareness, which is one of the goals in any meaningful treatment, is being fostered when the patient is being asked to direct her right brain attention to what she is experiencing in the moment, while being encouraged at the same time to engage her left brain capacity in the first part, to step back, detach, reflect, and recover her, let's see, sorry, and reflect and recover her objectivity, which would be the first half. So dual awareness, when you're asking her to direct her right brain attention to what she's experiencing in the moment, that's the second half, at the same time that she's being encouraged to engage her left brain capacity, to step back, detach, reflect, and recover her objectivity. In the psychoanalytic literature, this distinction between experiencing something and observing it is described as a healthy split in the ego, not pathological split in the ego, defensive splitting, good and bad. No, 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 no. But a healthy split in the ego between, all the way back, Richard Sturba in 1934, and then much later, Leston Havens in 1976 in his book Participant Observation. A healthy split in the ego between the experiencing or participating ego or self. I should add that word self also. And the observing or reflecting ego or self. Again, dual awareness. And here's a nice little image here. Engaging both the analytic wisdom of the observing ego and the emotional relational wisdom of the experiencing ego. And in time, our patients will say, I do know that. I should just get on with getting together, start the diet or do this or get back and apologize or reach out and this and that. But I find myself, I don't know, it's just too hard. There's a primitive part of me that just feels like, no, I don't want to be forgiving. They begin to name and acknowledge both sides of the civil war going on inside of them, the thing that's jamming them up and getting them conflicted. Model 1, classical psychoanalytic stuff. Please note that this is an important slide. I love it. As tempting as it might be for the therapist to highlight in the first portion of the conflict statement something that she wishes the patient already knew, if the patient does not yet know it, then it's important that the therapist resist the temptation to lead the witness in this way. For example, let's say that you start your conflict statement with, you know that your unresolved feelings about your father are making it hard for you to find an appropriate life partner. Now, although that might well be true, saying it to a patient who does not yet know it risks making her feel misunderstood and perhaps even more defensive. It is also, in effect, a subtle form of cheating that is fundamentally unfair to the patient because they don't know it. They haven't said it. I mean, you may know it, or at least you suspect it. You kind of think it, but they don't know it. So you can't say, you know, that your unresolved feelings about your father are making it hard for you to find an appropriate life partner. They know they're having trouble finding an appropriate life partner, but they didn't know it was related to unresolved feelings about their father. So you have to ease their way into that. You can't just blurt that out and lead the witness in that way. They're not there yet. It's not fair. It's cheating. Even so, I've sometimes done that by mistake. And then you make the patient even more defensive and you have shot yourself in the foot effectively. All right, consider the following clinical moment. A patient of mine, this happened recently, upon hearing me answer the phone at the time of our appointment with a warm and expectant hello, responded, "You sounded surprised." Okay, relevant data points. I've worked with this patient weekly for over 8 years. She lives in another state. She always calls precisely on the dot. I always answer precisely on the dot. She had called on the dot that day, and I had answered on the dot that day. And yet she said, "You sounded surprised." My clinical formulation. This was a moment of Model 1, pure projection, story about her, what was going on in her head. The direct externalization, in this case, that's what a projection would be, of a disavowed psychic fragment onto me as a blank screen with the objectivity of a surgeon, a la Freud. If indeed there had been some contribution from me, then we shift to Model 3, where we actually have co-creation of transference, countertransference, messiness, and impasse, potential impasse, mutual enactment. But actually, no, I mean, not any part of me was surprised, not any part at all. This was pure projection, Model 1. Now, I think, let me do the next slide quickly, but then I'm going to give you an example of theoretically what I said. I did sort of say it, but not quite as well as I presented on the slide here. But clinical resolution, so I'm telling you what then happened after I gave my sentence, but I want to do this. Clinical resolution. Once we explored her distorted perception of me as having been surprised, negative transference, my patient came to appreciate that the idea of being surprised had in fact originated from within her and been projected onto me. We then traced this projection back to a series of traumatic childhood moments when she had quite literally been forgotten, lost track of by her mother, who had later responded with genuine surprise upon her daughter's sudden appearance. My patient's "you sounded surprised" was therefore not at all about me, but a reverberation of that forgotten child's heartbreak. Now, this is, again, I didn't formulate it quite as well in the moment with her, but this is what technically I could have said. So I didn't quite get all of this said, but in essence, and I knew that she'd had a mother. What I did know is I knew she'd had a mother who, quite frankly, would periodically lose track of her. I didn't know all the details, but I knew that from our having worked together over the course of our 8 years. Okay. Okay, the first part, I did get the first part in real life. I actually did say this. On some level, you knew that I wasn't actually surprised to be hearing from you because you always call right on time, and I've always been here to pick right up without missing a beat. Now, did she know that? Yes, she's not crazy. I mean, she did know. I wasn't really surprised because she always calls on time, and I always pick up, and that's what we do. So, but let me just say, the power of negative transference, Model 1 negative transference, although again, if it becomes actualized, it's Model 3. But neurotic transference, just one person, where it's a story about projection, and the therapist, blank screen, onto the patient is projecting. The patient, because of their attachment to the old bad, it's easier for them to experience you as surprised, as critical, as old bad, because that's all they've ever known. And for them to experience you as something other than what they've always known would mean that they would have to get it that their life could be, and therefore could have been different had their parent, had their caregiver early on been kind and loving and listening and there and excited and eager in a way that the caregiver was not. So that in the repetition compulsion or the reenactment compulsion, that there is, the lure of, in Stephen Mitchell's terms, the familial and therefore familiar, because that's all the patient has ever known. And having something different would highlight the fact that things could be and could therefore have been different. And it's too painful to have to think about that. So the assumption is made that you'll be bad like the way my parent was. Now, in the repetition compulsion, there's an upside and a downside to everything. And in the repetition compulsion, there is also a part of the patient that has a desire to achieve belated mastery, which is why when the patient delivers the repetition compulsion into the treatment in model 1 or the reenactment compulsion onto the stage of the treatment in model 3, we rejoice. Even if it's like, oh dear, we're going to be in for a rough ride for the moment here. We're glad because now we have an opportunity, belatedly, to do what was not done prior to this point. Thus, their distorted perception of the world around them. All righty. All right. So what I said was, on some level, you knew. So I was challenging her negative transference. So it was going to make her a little anxious. You knew that I wasn't actually surprised to be hearing from you because you always call right on time, and I've always been here to pick right up without missing a beat. Option 1. But deep down, there was another part of you, a younger, more vulnerable part, that was afraid I might have lost track of you, just as your mother had done so painfully all those many times when you were so very little, so breakable, and so in need of being remembered. And so for a moment, you feared that maybe I, too, might have forgotten our time together. Now, option 2 would have been, but another part of you, younger, more tender, still carrying the ache of having been so often forgotten by your mother, feared that maybe I, too, had lost track of you, that maybe I, too, had let you slip from my mind, just as she had done all those many times when you were small, unprotected, and so deeply in need of being remembered. And so, for a moment, it felt as though I, too, might have forgotten our time together. Now, let me say, the earlier slide signals what it is that we went on to talk about more specifically all those times when her mother had indeed forgotten about her. In the moment, though, again, I didn't say it quite as articulately as this, she cried. She cried in response to what I said, and did some grieving and some remembering and re-experiencing and so on in a way that was really very powerful and very moving, all based on that interpreting of her negative neurotic transference, whereby she was experiencing me through the filter of the world as not caring and not remembering, which is the story about her mother. All right. Okay, this is important. This is something from Tony Chris. May he rest in peace. Um, he up here in Boston, a psychoanalyst. So the patient's inner conflictedness, this is real important, can take the form of, so the jammed up Civil War, can take the form of either divergent conflict, so coexisting voices, each carrying a truth. Shall I wear my red dress or shall I wear my blue dress? Or convergent conflict, the emerging self as opposed by a defensive, silencing voice. That's convergent conflict. Tony Chris highlights the distinction between. So divergent conflict are classic either-or dilemmas involving two mutually exclusive choices. Oh, wow, that's an interesting way to spell choices, isn't it? Okay. Shall I wear my blue dress tonight or my red dress? A tension between two viable options that are not particularly related to each other directly. One that will be chosen, the other relinquished. No compromising, just one or the other. Divergent conflict, beautiful image of divergent conflict. Now, structural or neurotic or intrapsychic conflicts that Freud was talking about of classical psychoanalytic theory are actually best understood as convergent conflicts. So Model 1 conflict statements then are designed to address these convergent both and conflicts with an eye to generating internal tension between, repeating myself here, the two poles, anxiety provoking, but ultimately growth promoting, empowering, yes, forces, and anxiety assuaging, but growth impeding, disempowering, resistant, defensive, no counterforces. You know that you are playing with fire by being romantically involved with your boss. Do they know that? Yes. But it just feels so good that right now you're not quite yet prepared to end it. Yeah. The second part wouldn't even need to be said, but for the fact that you've named the first part. So Model 1 conflict statements okay. On the other hand, Model 1 conflict statements are of no use for divergent either or conflicts. Indeed, you would not advance the therapeutic endeavor much were you to say to the patient, you know that you could wear your blue dress tonight, but you find yourself thinking that perhaps you should wear your red dress instead. That really doesn't advance anything. It's like, well, yeah, I do my blue dress, do my red dress. But these are two sort of, remember that image. So here are just some more Model 1 conflict statements. So you first challenge disruptive attunement by directing the patient's attention to where you would want her to go, and then you support homeostatic attunement by resonating empathically with where she is. Let's see if these work. You know that eventually you'll need to face the reality that your mother was never really there for you, and that you won't get better until you let go of your hope that maybe someday you'll be able to make her change. But you're not quite yet ready to deal with all the pain around that because you're afraid that were you to face that horrible reality, you might never survive the heartbreak and despair you would then feel. Doesn't that highlight beautifully how you've so landed where they are that you understand why they have the need to defend themselves in the way that they do? Here's another one. You know that ultimately you'll need to confront and grieve the reality that Sergei, like your dad, is not available in the ways that you would have wanted him to be. And that until you've made your peace with that painful reality, you'll continue to be miserable. But in the moment, all you can think about is what you can do to make him love you more. Finally, you know that you won't feel truly fulfilled until you're able to get your thesis completed. But you continue to struggle, fearing that whatever you might write just wouldn't be good enough or capture well enough the essence of what you're trying to convey. You were told too many times by your father that you just weren't smart enough to make it in the world. See how much you can pack into a conflict statement where there's an internal ache, internal turmoil, and anguish and pain because of messages they'd gotten early on, at such that they're now kind of jammed up. Again, the conflict often between being, can I be bad? Can I do my thing? Can I do what I want to do? Or must I be good? Must I do what's expected of me? Or what I was taught somehow I should do? I'm thinking about a consultation I did on a woman. She came to me for one shot consultation. She was just miserable for many reasons, one of which was because of her profession. She was about 35. She was a lawyer and so on. And she was depressed about her marriage and other things as well. But we got to talking about her work as a lawyer. And I said, what got you into the profession to begin with? And she said, well, my father, a lawyer, always wanted me to be a lawyer from way back. I said, okay, well, at least, said I, in my inimitable way, I said, well, at least though you're unhappy, at least your dad must be very proud of you and very happy. And she said, well, actually, my dad died when I was 16. So he never even knew that she'd become a lawyer. So here she had sort of internalized or introjected probably this expectation from the father and had never been able to extricate herself from it. And here she was as a lawyer, so not wanting to be a lawyer, but not letting herself sort of do her thing. Can I be bad? Can I just do what my heart would tell me to do? Or must I conform to? Must I comply? Must I be good and do what was expected of me and what my father wanted me to do? She was struggling with the neurotic conflict. I mean, isn't that interesting? I mean, heartbreaking. Her father died. He never even knew that she'd become a lawyer. Okay, let me just see. Okay, we've already done those. All right. Oh, here, a beautiful one of convergent conflict, right? So that there's the queen, and then that's the night. And the night, right, it wouldn't need to be doing that, reacting in that way, but for the fact that the queen landed on that spot, such that the knight then knocks it over. That's convergent conflict. Okay. So real quickly, like my eyes on the time here, so let me just move quickly here. So by locating squarely within the patient herself, the conflict between what she knows and what she, made anxious, finds herself thinking, feeling, or doing in order to avoid that knowing, the therapist is deftly sidestepping the potential for a struggle, a power struggle, conflict between herself and the patient. Now, let me say in model 3 with projective identification, there can be even knockdown drag outs. That's a little different. That's a little different something. But here, so often cases will be presented at conferences and stuff where patient and therapist is not even, I mean, it's a projective identification, I guess, but they're just struggling where the therapist says, yes, 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 you should. And the patient says, no, 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 I don't want to. I don't want to. Yes, you should. No, I don't want to. And we want to put the conflict, the civil war where it belongs, inside the patient. So by doing that with these conflict statements, the therapist is deftly sidestepping the potential for a struggle between herself and the patient. More specifically, whenever the therapist introduces a conflict statement with, you know that, she is gently forcing the patient to take ownership of what the patient, albeit begrudgingly, actually does know. If instead the therapist, in a well-meaning but misguided attempt to urge the patient forward, simply resorts to telling the patient what the therapist herself knows, not only will the therapist be running the risk of forcing the patient to become even more entrenched in her stance of defiant protest, but the therapist will also be depriving the patient of any real incentive to take responsibility for her own desire to get better. And sometimes when cases are presented to me in the spot supervisions, often the therapist will be offering the patient brilliant interpretations, but they're all coming from the therapist. And the patient will sometimes says, oh, yes, yes, good point, yes, yes, but sometimes in essence says, no, no. So the therapist will say, you need to, or you are doing this because you this, that, whatever. Brilliant interpretation, totally true, but it's sort of like bypassing the patient's own awareness and holding of themselves responsible and accountable and therefore empowered for what the patient herself knows. So it's just kind of by putting in, you know that, it's just a kind of clever way of avoiding an unnecessary power struggle. All right, let me see. Okay. In other words, by way of the judicious, again, you can't cheat and attribute to the patient that they know something that they don't, by way of the judicious and ongoing use of conflict statements that compel the patient to become aware of and to take responsibility, her state of internal dividedness. Model 1 is about internal dividedness, about, for example, getting better, in short, her ambivalence. The therapist will be able masterfully to avoid becoming deadlocked in a power struggle with the patient, a power struggle that can easily enough unfold if the therapist takes it upon herself to represent the adaptive voice of reality by overzealously advocating for the patient to do the right or healthy thing, a position that in turn risks leaving the patient, made anxious, no choice but to become the defensive voice of opposition. Okay, now let me just see. So real briefly, let me just say, because my eye is on the time here. Please also note the implicit message delivered by the therapist in the second part of a conflict statement when she uses temporal expressions such as for now, right now, at the moment, in the moment, at this point in time. When she includes that, in the second part of a conflict statement. She doesn't have to, but if she does, these expressions are deliberately chosen to honor the patient's current investment in a dysfunctional defense, but highlighting, in essence, for now, yes, but the implication is at some point this might change. By inserting these time-bound qualifiers, the therapist is gently implying that the patient's defensive position, although in the present understandably entrenched and conditioned, is not necessarily fixed or permanent, and that even if for now the patient would appear to be committed to holding on to the familiar defense, because that's all she's ever known, the lure of the familial and therefore familiar, a la Stephen Mitchell, as I mentioned before, there remains the possibility that at another point in time, something new and different could potentially emerge, something new good potentially. Now, this parenthetically, as we sit with our patients, we will often become aware of tension, not only within them, dialectical tension, but within ourselves as well. Dialectical tension between, on the one hand, our vision of who we think the patient could be, were she but adaptively able, willing to make healthier choices. And on the other hand, our respect for the reality of who she is and for the choices, no matter how unhealthy, that she defensively finds herself feeling compelled to make. Now, I have this, for example, with one of my patients who's into child pornography. There's a part of me that's sort of like, oh my God, if only you would make a healthier choice for yourself. My God, it's even illegal on the one hand, but then also knowing that, sort of just exhorting him to sort of like, let it go, let it go. Right, but are respecting the reality and honoring, the choice, if you will, that need to understand a little bit why that choice, the undertow. And indeed, as we together, I mean, we both are tempted to just want to sort of like, by God, let it go. But as we are sitting with and trying to understand the need for it, we come to appreciate that the undertow has to do with some early on stuff where he was the victim of some child sexual abuse. So now he is doing unto, in fantasy anyway, what was done unto him. So doer and done to. So but tricky, right? So when we would want the patient, like, just study for your exam, or just do this, or just, marry him for Christ's sakes, or get out of the marriage to her, or whatever, just whatever. And yet they don't. So we're torn inside ourselves by dialectical tension, trying to find within ourselves an optimal balance between wanting the patient to change and therefore challenging her, and accepting the reality of who she is and therefore supporting her. So, yeah, so we too struggle for sure. Challenge, support. Do I challenge or support? Or perhaps do both. And then my next lovely slide here. Indeed, we all find ourselves sometimes very confused about what to do next, not quite sure what to do right now. Do not follow, keep left. I found that online somewhere. It's just perfect. Okay, or Yogi Berra's, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Well, that tells you a lot. All right. So the last section here, my eye is on the time. Sorry, we're going to run over a little bit, but I hope you can stay with me on this. Okay, the creation of internal incentivizing tension between the gain and the pain of clinging to defensive resistance. We want to get the patient from resistance, the R word, the defense, to resilience and adaptive psychological resilience and flexibility, which would be awareness or insight, which is an important first step in the direction of deep embodied change. Sometimes you may get lucky, and it is actually a big T transformation. They're like, oh my God, I had not realized. And in that moment, there really is a quantum shift. Sometimes that does happen. Sometimes that does happen. Often not, but sometimes. All right. Life is a balance between holding on and letting go, Rumi, which in a way is sort of what we're talking about when we're talking about the adhesiveness to the old bad, the adhesiveness to old bad. And it's powerful. It's powerful indeed. All right. So the arc of Model 1, from defensive resistance to adaptive awareness, that's what we're talking about here, through ongoing iterative healing cycles of destabilization in reaction to challenge, anxiety-provoking challenge, and then restabilization in response to anxiety-assuaging support, and by tapping into the patient's underlying resilience and innate capacity to self-correct or self-right in the face of optimal challenge. And these ongoing cycles of disruption, repair, and reconstituting and reconsolidating at ever more evolved, ever more nuanced levels of integration, balance, resilience, and adaptive capacity. Counting upon Walter Buchanan's wisdom of the body to do what it needs to correct for internal dissonance. The classical psychoanalysts and cognitive behavioral therapists talk about cognitive dissonance, but to correct for the internal dissonance or homeostatic imbalance or dyshomeostasis created by these optimally stressful, growth incentivizing, destabilizing mismatch experiences that are created by our conflict statements that juxtapose left brain mediated adaptive capacity with right brain mediated defensive need. Whew. And the working through of which and the resolution of which is at the heart of the therapeutic action in Model 1. And it's at the heart of the therapeutic action, Models 2, 3, 4, and 5, but the language is a little different and the components are a little different, but the concept is still the same, creating mismatch experiences and working through them and resolving them in order to get from defense to adaptation, from rigidity to resilience. Whew. Okay, but Model 1, at its core, Model 1, the interpretive perspective of the Stark method, which lifted from classical psychoanalysis, my training in the 1970s at the Boston Psychoanalytic, is indeed a carefully titrated effort to guide the patient from deeply entrenched resistance toward increasingly resilient awareness. From clinging to rigid, dysfunctional defenses, though, that had once felt self-protective and necessary as a reaction to traumatic stressors, from that to cultivating ever-evolving insight into both their early origins and the ways in which they continue to operate in the present, and ultimately toward empowered capacity and readiness to relinquish those dysfunctional, rigid defenses. As we know, because most defenses are sustained by ambivalence, the task is gently to illuminate both sides of that ambivalent attachment to old, bad, rigid defenses and old, bad narratives, although that's not really the language of classical psychoanalytic theory. Roy Schaefer talked about narrative therapy, but for the most part, classical psychoanalysts don't talk about narratives per se. Model 5, yes. Model 1, no. So in other words, the task, gently illuminate both sides of the ambivalent attachment to old, bad, rigid defenses in order to shift what had once been ego-syntonic toward what is becoming increasingly ego-dystonic, thereby setting the stage for incentivized change. Now, these two terms, ego-syntonic, S-Y-N, and come to find out, synergy has the same root as syntonic. Who knew? I didn't know until somebody pointed that out to me. So ego-syntonic means something that is kind of problematic, but quite frankly, it works for the person. They don't really recognize it as being a problem. but it is a problem. And we want to shift those their egosyntonic defenses, those egosyntonic things that they do, to ever more ego dystonic, which takes them a little closer to, so more ego aliens are like, oh, maybe it's not so good that I'm this way. Ego dystonic, it doesn't work for me to be being this way. More ego dystonic, which is heading them in the direction of ultimately relinquishing the attachment to the old bad. Okay, here we go. So from egosyntonic to ego dystonic is what we're talking about, and that's the turning point in the therapeutic action of Model 1. If defenses are ever to be relinquished, they must first be experienced as ego dystonic, that is, as no longer in sync with who the patient would want to be. Defenses that have long been egosyntonic must be made to feel increasingly alien and costly, such that the pain of maintaining them begins to outweigh the secondary gain of still holding on. Let me say that again, such that the pain of maintaining them begins to outweigh the gain of still holding on. To that end, I've developed, not just even my regular conflict statements, although you're busy doing those too, a particular kind of conflict statement to which I refer as a price-paid conflict statement, designed specifically to create incentivizing internal tension in the patient by juxtaposing, this is a little more specific even than a regular conflict statement, the patient's dawning awareness of just how costly her defenses are becoming, with an eye to making them more ego dystonic, with her evolving recognition of just how deeply invested she has been in holding on to them even so, with an eye to highlighting how egosyntonic they are. So we're really taking on both the cost, the price paid, and the benefit, the payoff. And naming to create in these price-paid conflict statements internal tension, cognitive dissonance, homeostatic imbalance, a mismatch experience between price paid and investment in, cost and benefit, pain and gain. All right, that's a price paid statement. More specifically, price-paid conflict statements spotlight the patient's ambivalent attachment to her defenses. In order to generate growth-incentivizing internal cognitive and affective dissonance, the therapist will, whenever possible, construct a price-paid conflict statement designed to foster the patient's ever-evolving awareness. Model 1 is about awareness. It privileges thinking, cognition, insight, reflection, self-reflective introspection. A price-paid conflict statement designed to foster the patient's ever-evolving awareness of both the psychic pain, the cost, and the emotional gain, the benefit, of remaining invested in the dysfunction even so. The prototypical intervention, you know that, there's the you know that, pain, price paid, pain, cost, but you remain gain even so. You know that price paid, but you remain invested in payoff even so. Okay, these carefully crafted formulations, price-paid conflict statements, are intended to make the patient's ambivalently held, narcissistically cathected, whatever, defenses less egosyntonic and more ego-dystonic, and thereby to galvanize her to take action to resolve the internal dissonance and restore a new, more adaptive homeostatic balance at a higher, more refined, more nuanced, more complex level of integration and balance. Here we go. So first, challenge the defense by directing the patient's attention to the pain, the cost, the price paid for old bad, and then support the defense by resonating empathically with the secondary gain benefit payoff of holding on to it even so. You know that you're paying a steep price for not taking seriously the toll your drinking is having on your health and your life, especially in light of the DUIs and your problems now at work. But at this point, you still feel reluctant to let it go because right now, and since your wife left, alcohol feels like the only real escape you have left in your life. You know that sooner or later, right, we're giving them a little bit of leeway time-wise, you'll need to confront the impact that extra weight is having on your health, physically, emotionally, and medically. But right now, the idea of giving up the comfort of food feels unbearable, especially when you're already feeling so deprived in so many other parts of your life. You know that keeping people at arm's length has left you feeling painfully isolated, disconnected, and desperately lonely, right? The price paid. Do they know it? Yes. They've been complaining all this time about how alienated and isolated and alone they feel. But right now, there's that temporal element. The idea of letting someone in feels far too risky because the fear of being hurt again feels greater than the possibility of being loved. Okay, you know that you're paying a steep price for your refusal to stop smoking, especially in light of your recurrent lung infections, and that at some point you will probably have no choice but to quit cold turkey. In the moment, however, you find yourself feeling that you simply must hold on to the option of reaching for a cigarette, a lifeline to ease the overwhelming anxiety stirred up by the stress of the lawsuit. Now, by including the temporal element, the therapist is planting a quiet seed of hope that even as the patient clings for now to the familiar lifeline of the defense, a future might yet emerge in which something less costly and more life-giving could begin to take its place. All right, now we're getting near the end here. By highlighting the growing disconnect, mismatch between the gain, the benefit, the emotional payoff of holding on to old bad, right? I promised I was going to talk about leveraging the pain of contrast between old bad and new good. Here we go. By highlighting the growing disconnect, by leveraging the disconnect between the gain, benefit, emotional payoff of holding on to old bad and the pain, cost, psychic toll of doing so, the therapist begins gradually to shift the balance from the gain of old bad, in other words, the payoff that has sustained its egosyntonic grip, to the pain of old bad, the price paid that will eventually render the defense ego-dystonic, which is en route to letting it go. Indeed, Model 1, price paid conflict statements are powerful tools in the therapist's armamentarium because they generate ever-increasing internal dissonance, tension between the defense's lingering appeal and its mounting psychological cost. This carefully cultivated dissonance will in time tip the scales away from the preservation of defense and toward its eventual relinquishment. The preservation of old bad and the attachment, the adhesiveness to it towards embracing, towards relinquishing it, and ultimately embracing something new, different, and compellingly better. Yes, indeed. And as we have repeatedly highlighted, introducing corrective challenge, right, mismatch experience, into a system will inevitably give rise to internal tension and a state of homeostatic imbalance, said again for the 10th time. But states of disequilibrium from an evolutionary point of view cannot be tolerated indefinitely for extended periods of time. Indeed, as described by Walter B. Cannon way back in 1932, the wisdom of the body is such that it will automatically self-correct or self-right, that is, call upon its innate capacity to recover from adversity by taking effective action to adapt to it. This powerful tendency to resolve the internal tension created by the discomfiting experience of mismatch and to restore homeostatic balance will be what fuels the process of change. Let me say it again. This powerful tendency to resolve the internal tension and to restore homeostatic balance, right? The wisdom of the body, inherent, built in, innate, intrinsic, will be what fuels the process of change. You make use of the state of homeostatic imbalance or disequilibrium. And with each iterative healing cycle, disruption, repair, destabilization, restabilization, of disruption and repair, destabilization and restabilization, the system will propel itself forward from defensive resistance toward adaptive awareness. Again, sometimes that's all it takes. And at other times, they're like, well, you need a little more. You need more Model 2 acceptance, Model 3 accountability, Model 4 accessibility or authentic presence, and Model 5 actualizing action. But Model 1 awareness, we all know, is an incredibly important step in our own mental health. Okay, a mnemonic to help you remember. Okay, we know where id was, there shall ego be. Where unconscious was, there shall conscious be. Where resistance was, there shall awareness be. So where the treacherous undertow, again, I love that word. My patients, I already said, use that often now to describe. It's like, ah, shit, man, my undertow is rearing its ugly head. So where the, excuse me for a moment. Thank you. Where the treacherous undertow once was, rendering the patient unconscious, dissociated, swept away by unseen emotional forces, there shall mindful presence be, empowering the patient to remain grounded, withstand the pull, and resist being swept away. As long as the gain is greater than the pain, the defense more egosyntonic than ego-dystonic. Our patients come to us, they have their defenses, often, usually egosyntonic. Problematic, but they're not even quite aware of just how problematic they are. So as long as the gain, secondary gain, is greater than the pain, and of course our conflict statements, especially the price paid ones, are designed to highlight both the gain, the investment in the second part, and the pain, the price paid in the first part. Anyway, as long as the gain is greater than the pain, the defense more ego-syntonic than ego-dystonic, the patient will maintain the defense and remain entrenched in her resistance. I hope you appreciate the sort of gain, pain, maintain, remain. But as a result of the patient's ever-evolving awareness of both the psychic cost, first half of the sentence, and the emotional investment, second half, once the pain becomes greater than the gain, the defense more ego-dystonic than ego-syntonic, the stress and strain, get it, strain, of the resulting cognitive and affective dissonance between the pain and the gain will ultimately generate the impetus needed for the patient gradually, progressively, to incrementally to relinquish her attachment to defensive resistance in favor of a new and more adaptive awareness. My last two slides. And the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom, Aeneas Nin. And in the prophetic words of Jelly Roll, accepting his Country Music Award a few years ago, you don't change until the pain to remain the same is greater than the pain it takes to change. All of these are sort of saying the same thing. I think that's it. Thank you for being here. Please let me say, if you'd like to be on my mailing list, many of you probably are, but if you'd like to be, and you aren't yet, or you'd like to join my entirely free 90-minute ongoing weekly spot supervision Zoom sessions, both live and recorded for later viewing on my private YouTube channel, please email me at marthastarkmd@synergymed.solutions. And all that's required to join is to have some familiarity with the Stark method of psychodynamic synergy. And I will welcome you with open arms and open heart. Or if you would like to subscribe to my new YouTube channel, please, I don't know how to say this because it's, the handle is The Stark Method. Is that the way you say it? I think you say it. The handle is The Stark Method. Please subscribe. I would really appreciate that. And here are some references, and I guess that's it. All right, well, listen, thank you all for being here. I'm very grateful to Wisconsin Psychoanalytic for having invited me. And if you have any questions at all, or want to just touch base with me, truly it will be my pleasure to, and I'm good about responding. So email me, marthastarkmd@synergymed.solutions. All right, bye for now, and thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing you again.